Welcome, welcome to Takeover Tuesday. I think this is the third one, and we are here to talk books and geekiness. I am Angela de Ramos. I am a fifth grade teacher. I don't know where I will be a fifth grade teacher, much like you. So, with that, there's a lot of uncertainty, and one of the focuses that we really wanted to bring this is looking forward. We don't know what we're going to do, but we know the path that we have been on before, because people have been on that path before us. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Francisco to give the land acknowledgement for those who came before us.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to take this moment to acknowledge the long journey that the indigenous ancestors who have lived in the land that is now Vallejo, California, the coastal Miwoks, and the Sassoon people. We take this moment to acknowledge their presence will be forever here on this land.
Hear, hear. So I wanted to say a little bit something about the land acknowledgement, because somebody has come up a couple of times and like, why do we do this in CTA? Why does NEA do this? And the idea is, in part, for me at least, relevant to today, is that we have a narrative, a working narrative of what a Native American is. For most people, it's like Squanto give corn and we eat turkey and everyone lives happily ever after. Done. And that's not the narrative that we know to be true. And the narrative that this country was founded by Columbus is not the narrative. So part of our task as educators is to break the narrative. So by acknowledging the people who were here in land and in spirit and in the journey and in the fight for freedom and equality, there were people here before us. So that's the reason why we do a land acknowledgement. So thank you for that, Francisco. Again, I'm Angela de Ramos. I am a teacher geek. We're here to talk about books. And a little bit about the format today. It is a webinar, so we don't have a chat going. What we do have is Q&A going. So we have a roundtable. We've got some amazing panelists, which I'm about to introduce in 2 seconds. And but feel free to put your questions, because we also have some moderators in the back and answering questions or surfacing things that you want to talk about. So we are moderating a chat, a Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in there. If there's things you want for more information, we did send slides. So if you're really geeky and you like the visuals, you can follow along with this conversation in some nice, neat slides, and there's resources and pictures and books and our contact information. So with that, we're going to ground in a little bit and remind yourselves why we're here. We're going to take a deep breath, and I'm going to invite you to push all the other stuff, the worries and the dog and the noise away, and take a deep breath and focus on what we're doing today so that we can get to it. Nice breath. Okay, racial narratives. So we're talking books. We're looking forward. We're looking forward to what we're doing in our classrooms, because most of us are right around the corner. So we thought it'd be a really fun idea to start thinking about actually what this looks like in the classroom with a way that you might want to launch your year. So I know me and my panelists all entered this work about talking about books because we use them in our work as a teacher, for linked arts, for ELD, for engagement, but we also use them as anti-racist teachers. So we don't have like they are all classroom teachers, and we just like to talk about books. So can you tell us who you are, what you teach, and what racial narratives, when I say racial narratives, what does that mean for you with who you are, who you teach? And I'll open it up.
Hi, my name is Francisco Ortiz. I also teach fifth grade, and I work in Richmond, representing United Teachers of Richmond. And to answer your first question about what racial narratives mean, I just have to reflect back on my very first understanding or really seeing kind of either myself, and I put that in quotes, represented in the media. And so that to me began with Speedy Gonzalez. And that was the very first time that I understood that I actually heard someone say a Spanish word on television. And so from that understanding, that is a or from my point of view, that was the first time I ever actually saw myself, but I didn't realize that that was the way my culture was racialized in popular culture.
Vanessa Robinson actually lives near me, and we have the distinction of being in a predominantly Latino community. So I know for me, I'm like the only Asian some of these kids have seen in their entire life. And the narrative they would be left with, if it weren't for me, is, oh, they're bat-eating, you know, crazy virus infecting foreigners, or they're all kung fu experts. And then they meet me. So I have narratives that I confront just by being in the room. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your racial narratives and how they play out in the classroom?
Okay, Vanessa Robinson. I am in Monterey County. I represent Greenfield Teachers Association. I teach fifth grade as well. I myself, I just think my entire life have been a walking confrontation to racial narratives because I'm biracial. My mom's white, my dad's black, and I grew up in a predominantly Hispanic community in Salinas, and then forged on to teach in a predominantly Hispanic community as well. And just moving through life biracial, you kind of feel racial narratives versus hear them. Between code switching, but even between my families, or just how I'm presented to the world. First question, right? What is she? That always fuels a lot of conversation around racial narratives. But then more specifically for my students in the classroom, what I've noticed is, I mean, it's the conversation we have about kids. They're not born racist. They hear narratives, right? And what I think a lot of my students don't understand is that there are narratives about people, right? And so what I love doing with literature is, one, exposing them to a specific narrative around positive images of different races. I tie in my own background when talking about these things, and you just, the energy you get from the students, they're like, wait, what? You're black? You know, it kind of is like living through the moment of not even creating a narrative, right? Working backwards. And then, so I think what I love about this panel and some conversations we can have is that talking about narratives doesn't always have to be explicit. We don't always have to point out what the negative narrative is, right? A lot of the time, I think our kids are in bubbles. So just depending on who you teach, like me in South County, it's about presenting a different narrative that will help them challenge the ones that are in the world once they get into the world. And then also help them see themselves in more positive lights through literature. Did I answer all your questions, Angela?
You totally did. You
Okay.
totally did. Someone else wanted, so just disrupting the narratives, it's in part stereotype. And I think Erica, I know, so Erica's a counselor. She comes at this from the standpoint of having to deliver the how we all get along and not be bullies standpoint. So combating those racial narratives really ends up, and I know it infuses a lot of your work. So right. How do you see the way racial narratives play out when you're with your students or your work as a counselor?
So like Angela said, I'm a school counselor. Currently, I'm a middle school counselor, but I was a elementary counselor for 5 years here in Riverside. And for me, it's I have the unique opportunity to go into all the classrooms and really, you know, present to them about social emotional learning and cultural, and it's a lot of it would be like, oh, let's everybody get along and we're all the same. For me, though, what's important is to teach the students and to have that conversation of we're not all the same, but it's okay. And what makes me different makes me unique, but it also, I have something to give to society and every other student, every culture, every race, everything that you have that makes you who you are. is what makes this such a great place, such a great school to be at, such a great classroom to be in. And so for me, it's just exploring those and making sure that the students know that, yeah, we're not all the same, and that's okay. We don't need to be the same. And so that's how I approach it with my students. And you know, it's a great opportunity that we get to have, and because we get to touch on a lot of the social justice and like you said, bullying and all that stuff. It gives us a bigger opportunity to really get in there and talk to these kids about that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that you're like that, those exercises you talk, I know Erica does this activity where they're really exploring their identities and the racial narratives or their own concepts of who they are sometimes come into conflict with what they, like Speedy Gonzalez, you know, Francisco's like, I'm not that. So letting them explore and making space for talking about what we look like and how we move through the world is okay. I can't tell you how many times people come to me and say, I don't mean to be racist, but what are you? And I'm like, dude, like, that's not racist. It's who I am. I wear it on my skin. You can clearly tell I don't have a certain phenotype. And most people who look like this come from Asia. So yes, you're right. But the question itself, talking about race is not racist. Using a racial narrative to impose some story for power's sake is where we have a problem. So being able to talk about race is sort of the step one. And I think, you know, everybody's kind of talked about, you know, the way using books, it removes that fear of feeling racist or not knowing how to talk about it, because people have talked about it for us. And we can call it text evidence when we actually bring it up. And it's not coming from in a point of indoctrination, or it's coming from a legitimate, you know, AR tested, you know, scholastic selling piece of literature that have won awards. So, you know, and I invited, let's see, Karen, is your sound okay? I wanted to.
I think my sound's okay.
Okay. So Karen, you know, the other question I get is like, well, what if I have a student, what if I'm on an all white area? Why should I teach racial narratives? Race isn't a problem here because we're homogeneous. And I'm sort of like, why are you segregated in the first place? But that's a different question, much deeper. So when you're in an all white area teaching all white students, you don't look like your students. Sometimes you have to approach talking about racial narratives different. And I think Karen does a really fantastic idea to introduce yourself, talk about racial narratives in your classroom.
I'm Karen Ridley, and I teach in Anaheim. I teach at Loera High School. I teach 11th grade ELA and AP language. And I actually teach in a predominantly Latino area. I live in a predominantly white area. So as the NEA director too, I'm trying to push these ideas in our more South Orange County schools as well. But what I've realized, even with my students, is many of them don't know they're people of color. They need to discover them. And so one of the things I do at the beginning of the year is, I always start with narrative. And our students don't know they have a narrative, or they only see one version of their narrative, and they need to see other narratives. They need to see other people of color's narratives. And I think, especially in 11th grade, you know, they're about to go to college. I'm really into developing their skills in really creating their own narrative, and also looking at models of other narratives that they may not have seen before. Because again, regardless of what area we teach in, our kids do live in quite a bubble. And they don't see other than what, you know, they only hear their own, these stereotypes perpetuated constantly, and they repeat them and they believe them. And so they need to see, again, their own narratives. They need to express their own narratives, see that they have a narrative, as well as explore narratives with other people of color. Because like I said, many of my students don't even see themselves as people of color until I come in and talk about unconscious bias and race and gender and things of that nature. So.
Yeah, I love what you said about like framing narratives and discovering your own narratives. And so that's sort of an entry. First, it's just being aware that there are narratives. So even just look at the media, look at news, Look, I remember looking through a magazine and every picture where they were on vacation was like all white people. And it was like only white people go on vacation. And I thought that was me. And then I started asking around to students of color and predominantly schools of color. And their conception of white teachers are that they all had swimming pools. Like it just came with being white. Like they legit thought this was a thing because it's the only narrative they didn't know any teachers. They'd never been to a teacher's house who was white. You know, they just didn't know. So being able to identify it, what they know is an entry point. And then introducing, Karen said it beautifully, it's connecting with other narratives. So you have other narratives and other stories, and then sort of disrupting those narratives and teasing out where they come into play. And, you know, you have some books that are, you know, not all books are created equal. And for this particular journey into books, we really focused on a type of book where it introduces narratives and conflicts within the story. So I'm going to turn this over to book talk, but I wanted to bring up where we want to go eventually on our journey with our book talk. So I read this book, Front Desk, this last year with my students. And in the story's about a little girl who has immigrated from China. They, you know, mom's an engineer, can't get work here. They're running a motel. And, you know, the economic hardship of being new and et cetera, and not speaking the language. But at the time, coronavirus, right when we got to the point where they're getting discriminated against in work, the virus and the news of, you know, Asian eating back people and getting stabbed because of the racial narratives that Asians brought this virus on us, it was right at that time. And so I just was like, I have to do something with this. The narratives are colliding from our book and real life. So the idea is to disrupt the narratives and then apply them, have some empathy. So we'd already done some empathy of like who we are and who this character is and the narratives that we face. But then I asked them, well, what would Mia do? What would happen to Mia's business if she were at the time of Corona? And, you know, the kids were like, well, we're on lockdown, so they're going to lose their, you know, they lose their money. So you know what? That's a valid response. That was some thinking and application of the plot and what would happen. You know, so it became a talking point and it became a way to not only disrupt the narratives, discuss the narratives, empathize with the narratives, but then do something with the narratives of what should be, because we want that vision of where we want to be along this journey. So with that, I talked about this book. I'm going to turn it over to my panelists to talk about like a book that they're going to use or, you know, we're launching. So what book is on your mind as in 2 weeks, you're like, I'm down to read this?
So one of the books that I absolutely love to teach with, and it's the first book in a series by the author Francisco Jimenez. Dr. Jimenez is a professor at Santa Clara University, and his autobiography or autobiographical narrative really focuses on his life as a migrant farm worker, as a child migrant farm worker, while navigating two worlds after he and his family migrate to the US during the 1940s. And so this has many different themes that are very relevant today. Themes like family separation, deportation, mixed immigration status. One of the big values and controlling idea for this family, and that is a relevant theme throughout the book, is integrity, faith, family, and making the best out of every possible situation that you can. Hard work and perseverance was the defining values that really propelled Francisco Jimenez into being the valedictorian of his school and being the very first person in his family to go to college, which is something that I very much identify with. As Vanessa said earlier, you know, I feel like I am a walking challenge to the stereotype. My older brothers and sisters were not able to complete high school, and so that was my academic outlook. My parents were worried that I was going to not graduate, and that was a very similar situation that Francisco was faced with in his journey with a school counselor. A counselor offered him, "Oh, well, we have plenty of farming and mechanics, you know, programs." Well, I want to be a teacher. Well, he has to go to college. His entire schedule was changed, and that was that very first time where Francisco realized that he was breaking his own stereotype. And so I like using this book, and I'm going to continue to use this book in the future because this is a very real example of experiential knowledge and writing your own narrative. Francisco's narrative was already decided for him by a person in power, and so he wrote his own narrative. I really love this book.
I love that. So for those of you who know the circuit, Vanessa and I think many of us do, live in areas where we still have migrant farm workers. So I also use this story in my classroom. And the part for me as a teacher, as someone who didn't grow up in this community and doesn't understand the forces and the way they have to navigate the world, was the scene where Francisco's dad, his back is hurting because he's working. I mean, you're stooped over. My back hurts mopping. So stooping over all day is murder on your back. And we all know when we have a backache, we're cranky. And his dad is living with chronic pain because of the work that he does. But he sucks it up and he goes to work every day. And Francisco sees him knowing he's in horrible pain because it's the imagery is the ashes, the piling up cigarettes, because when he's in pain, he smokes cigarettes. So he can tell it's a bad day when there's a big pile of cigarettes. But the scene that my kids like always love but it's the scene where he loses it. The dad's like had it because he's in pain and there's a parrot and he takes the broom, the parrot's making noise and the dad just loses it. And the thing is, my kids all can relate to this. And they all start having scenes where their parent lost it. And I'm kind of like, I don't think I want to hear all of the stories. But the idea that your dad is working and the evidence that your dad is sacrificing for your family and the ways that those come out. And then they start talking about it. And then they realize, wait, this guy made a whole story about something that I know, but it looks different for me. For my family, it's, you know, my dad slams the door and, you know, speeds off. I'm like, well, you could write that. That's your story of the same thing. So that particular book, Connecting, that's a really good evidence for me of being able to connect and have empathy with a character that's like them. And then we have stories where you have characters that are not like you, or you can play those out. So who else has got a good book that they're going to use?
So this might be like I use a lot of them, right? I love doing this this work, but since I spoke about being biracial, I'm going to talk about blended. I think it's fairly new. A lot of people haven't heard of it yet, and it's very, very modern, which is another reason why I love it. But there's also so much loadedness in this cover, right? When I got the book, I love pink. I heard so much about it, but my students were actually the ones that after a couple chapters pointed out that the ice cream she drops here on the cover is a black chocolate vanilla, and it makes some kind of brown color that's her skin, and she's a biracial girl. So a lot of the narratives in this book address what to feel like you have to code switch or to move between two worlds. It is actually set up in chapters by Mom's Week and Dad's Week. So her parents, her mom's white, her dad's black, they get divorced, and she has to kind of operate in this new space of switching every 7 days between the households. And this is where things really start to get complicated for her as far as figuring out does she have to follow one of these narratives of what makes her who she is, or can she create something on her own? And one thing that I love about what the author does with the actual character is piano. And me growing up in Salinas as a biracial girl around a lot of Hispanic community, you didn't see any Hispanic kids or African American kids playing the piano. Even myself, I'm guilty of it. I played the piano, but it was my mom's parents who signed me up for piano lessons. So again, we talk about creating narratives for kids that will disrupt ones that they face in the future. That is one for me that I feel like I had to live through to realize that it was okay to be a pianist if I wanted to, that they look like me, but instead I'm showing that, right? And so middle school's like, and she goes to a predominantly white school. Her dad, actually, the African American one in the story, is the wealthier one, which disrupts more narratives, if you know about biracial families. And her mom's kind of the struggle, like not struggling, but middle class working. But at school, there's maybe like 5 African American kids. Oh, me. Like it's my whole life story playing out here. And it centers around a modern time, right, between the Black Lives Matter movement, and they find a noose in one of her friend's lockers. And so it actually becomes really explicit, the lessons in the story from their history teacher about exactly the work we're trying to do with this book talk, right? About how do we uplift everybody, kind of touching on what Erica said, that, or was it was Erica, right? That said that, yeah, that we're not all different and that's okay. Because it's something that, like Jason Reynolds says in the book Stamped, is that the only thing racist is that when thinking about what's wrong with Black people is thinking there might be something wrong with Black people. And so kind of just totally dispelling that. And this book does an amazing job at it. And I love that it do it from a teacher perspective. So I also suggest this to colleagues who are hesitant about how to get started, because the book kind of does it for you as well. And there's a lot of really good stopping points and things that you'll just feel naturally where you need to stop and maybe have further discussion. And I'm sure we'll move through that in this of some activities you can do after certain chapters, or just when you feel the vibes in the room from your kids, looking at their faces and when to stop and maybe do Angela's activity hashtag, which I won't say for her, but I'll let her explain that. But yeah, so Blended's a great one to get started with, especially if you want to bring in multi-layered racial issues.
I love how you said the book will do it for you. So, most of the books that we chose, by the way, they're mostly 5th and 6th. The ones that we're sort of highlighting right now are mostly around our grade levels, 5th and 6th. But Erica kind of has the range of things, and then Karen has some upper grades. So those are in the slides. We have lots of book lists and resources laid in there. So I just highlighted this part that I was reading in front desk, where she kind of talks about, she says, she's at the front desk and she's realizing that there's discrimination. So when there's a Black customer, the other motels like turn them away, or they accuse them of like stealing stuff. So in the book, the racial narratives of like the Black criminal are super activated. And she confronts someone, and the clerk says, "I don't know, don't get me wrong, kid. I know where you're coming from, but you and I both know that every time we push the buzzer, we're judging someone based on the way they look. I mean, it's not like we're judging them based on their personality or how they eat a fig. We make a quick 10-second decision based on what they look like. And that's also how people get shot." So, we're introduced to the character that's being judged. And so there's an entry point in to discuss what people's perceptions and actions are. And, there was a question about like, well, how do we call people? Like the question from Myra was, how do we identify? Like, should we say Black, white, like it triggers something? And it's not the label, it's the meaning behind it. And so I know in front desk, it's the label and the visual. So that's the narrative, right? It's the story that's assigned to your concept. And then there's conflict within it. So these books are kind of rich with those times where you could talk about how people are reacting within the story. I mean, if you are not comfortable talking about your own community or the larger world of Black Lives Matter or any of it, you can still remain within the book and talk, because there's conflict, there's character conflict, and there's point of view, and there's motive to discuss, and those things can remain in the book. We don't want them to stay in the book because we want to learn together about our society and being good citizens. But the lower grade books, I think, Erica, I know you've had a couple of books more about being different or about identifying sort of more of a introductory part on ourselves as in the book. Do you want to share any of the books that you use for that kind of work?
So one of the things that I always like to share when I do this workshop is to be very careful when you're selecting books, just because it's the cover is nice or the author is somebody that you know. And I had this experience, and I always bring it up. It was a first and second grade class that I read the book called Cupcake by Taye Diggs. Sorry, not Cupcake, Chocolate Me. And in the story, it's an African-American boy, and he's dark-skinned, and the neighbor kids they start making fun of him. So he goes home and he tells his mom, I'm so upset, they're saying that I'm too dark. And the mom's like, oh, you're chocolate, and so she goes through this, and she does a really good job at explaining it to him as to why he should feel, worthy and enough, and how he can tell his friends. But the way that it ends is they make chocolate cupcakes for all the kids that were making fun of him. So I'm reading this book, and then this little first grader raises her hand, and she's like, wait, but so they get a cupcake even though they were being mean? And I was like, you're right, that doesn't make sense. And then so it became a big discussion as how do we handle that? How do we handle when somebody is being mean or saying things about the way somebody looks, the way somebody acts, talks, the church they go to? And it really turned it into something completely different. My intention for the book was, I want to show them that it's okay to be different colors. And it turned into no, how do we address those situations? And when is it okay to say, you know what, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I don't need to be your friend if you're going to have those ideas. Or, hey, this is the way and explaining it to them. And these kids had some really great ideas. And then so what we did was they had to just write their own ending. How would it end? And, again, it was that thing of it went somewhere different, but it was okay. It was student driven, and it was what they wanted to do. So, and there's a ton of other books that, I've used kindergarten books with, 5th graders and 6th graders because they love picture books. And I think sometimes we forget that, the older the kids are, they don't need to have a long chapter book. You can introduce a small one. Maybe you just have 15, 20 minutes that you can introduce a book to. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of find like the little kid books tend to be, they're so egocentric. So it's all about me and about who I am in the world and discovering that. And the actions taken, we want to move from books to action, to being a good citizen. I mean, that's sort of the point of us teaching, right? We're creating humans who are supposed to human in the world. And that means have some decency and some civility and have words to speak when you have conflicts. Otherwise you get bullshit like we do now. So the little kid stuff is, you really can gear that teaching to like, you don't have to react, or you can be mad, or you can say something. And that's sort of the action that we can coach our kids to through those kind of dialogues. With the middle grades, it's, you can leave it as the story. It's always, like, I know Francisco and I talked about this whole thing of, making connections with the story. But what middle kids really like is the conflict, right? They like drama because they're 5th and 6th grade and they like to engineer it. So, points of intersectionality are the way for me to sort of approach those discussions around those middle age, just developmentally. And the books tend to lend themselves. It's about conflicts and when those narratives crash, whether they're two worlds within the story, like in Vanessa's, or there's a homogeneous world like in the circuit, but then the school is the clashes with the school and the larger society. Karen, however, teaches on the other end of the spectrum where she's teaching in high school. So the application, I mean, these are kids who can voice things. And I've seen some of the feedback that Karen's gotten from her students because they're meta and well-written enough to actually give her feedback that is very genuine. So, you know, Karen, with working with your students, and you have a very structured curriculum in which to discuss narratives, racial narratives and identity, but then you find that kids do something with it and get motivated beyond. So do you want to kind of talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk briefly about kind of how I approach it. Obviously, my curriculum is very, I take my English class from a social and racial justice angle. It's not officially called that. I've had this curriculum pushed back twice to me, telling me we're not ready for it in our district. So I just go ahead and teach it anyway. I don't care. I just teach it anyway. And the feedback I have received from my students has been positive, especially in the midst of what's happening right now. Just some ideas, and I like to give people ideas of what to do with any text that you find relevant, especially when you're teaching a racial narrative, especially from a white woman's perspective, to be honest. So oftentimes I'll start with something like House on Mongo Street by Sandra Cisneros, because it's written in vignettes, and kids can see sort of the short narrative, right, the vignettes. And a lot of people in our district think that it should be taught in junior high, but the mature subject matter actually lends itself better to 11th and 12th graders. But this is also a way to teach them narrative strategies in shorter stories in vignette style. I also do a lot of poetry, that we do some slam poetry and things like that, which starts the narrative process, again, in small pieces so that they can eventually develop a longer narrative, right, a full narrative. Another book that I highly regard is The Yellow Raft in Blue Water. And this takes 3 generations of Native American women and tells their story and just unravels, I mean, it uncovers just such a complexity of 3 different lives woven together. And what I've done with that is I've had kids actually take a 4th generation and write the narrative of the 4th generation had they written a narrative. You know, they can kind of take, you know, again, kids have a lot of choice in my class, but that's one option of something you can do. Kids are very engaged with that novel. One that I've in particular been really compelled by recently is the book Dear Martin. And this is a book, I mean, it's obviously very complex, but Justice is a Black boy that lives in a very white world. He attends a prep school. His mother and him kind of quote unquote left behind the other neighborhood. And that's kind of how it's spoken about. What I like about this book is it gives the opportunity. I like to bring in nonfiction, current events, articles with literature. And it lends itself to those opportunities. There's actual discussion in dialogue format in this book between the teacher and the students about racial justice. You know, one of the white students says something like, oh, there's already equality. And then there's another conversation when Justice gets into Harvard. Oh, he only got in because of affirmative action. And the entire classroom is having this conversation in real time in the book. And what a perfect opportunity for a teacher to stop right then and there and model that same conversation with his or her students. Of course, using, you know, I give my students a lot of sentence stems and sentence frames. You really have to practice that from the beginning of the year with non-controversial ideas before you move into the more, I don't see race as, you know, a controversial idea so much as a necessary idea that needs to be discussed. But the great thing about this book is that what he does is he looks to the teachings of Martin in every incident. So right after he's arrested in the beginning of the book, he starts a journal and he addresses every entry, Dear Martin, and it's to Martin Luther King Jr. And so this really explores, the question is, do Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings still hold up? And that's really the thematic kind of idea or question around this text. And so he starts this journal to find out, are MLK Jr.'s teachings still relevant even in his current life? It's super powerful, but what a great way to stop in sections and say, okay, we're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I teach it explicitly in my class, but you know, if a teacher is uncomfortable just coming out with that, you know, again, the book lends itself to those ideas. It's a great discussion starter for a teacher to just kind of let your students lead the discussion and guide the discussion. But what a great way to bring in, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. texts, and to bring in current events, Colin Kaepernick, about what happened, you know, with Colin Kaepernick, about Trayvon Martin, all of these experiences, kind of a compilation of experiences that we see far too often, unfortunately. And he's now experiencing them as a Black man who's, you know, going to college next year. And so this is a really powerful text. And like I said, I think it lends itself to, you know, it could be poetry, it can be current events, it can be nonfiction, and great discussion, because you can actually stop where these students and teachers are having this discussion in the novel, model it, and then have that discussion with your students. One thing I will say is that I do start any units on race, I do start with the Seattle Times, it's not Conversations on Race, why am I forgetting the name of this? Anyway, Seattle Times has a great, basically it's a bunch of conversations about different terms and how to talk about race. And I let that, my students thinking that, you know, it's not really even coming from me, it's coming from discussions. And then my students become included in those discussions and have those same discussions. Because, you know, it is a topic that many people find sensitive. I had a kid removed from my class this year. Mom was not happy that I was talking about gender and race. So, you know, you have to kind of introduce these topics and do so where, you know, it's not just you telling them or indoctrinating them, but look at what's going on in the world. Look what other people are having. Where do you fit into this conversation, and what do you think about these things? So, yeah, I mean, it's so complex in high school, but I'm really excited for the upcoming year. Regardless if it's distance learning, I have so many ideas. But those are some of the things that I would recommend, especially when teaching narrative, because you can bring in so many other types of writing, and that's what we teach our students. Is narrative can be argument, it can be, it can be factual. I mean, it really incorporates expository writing and argumentative writing, and narrative really incorporates all the types of writing. So
I told you Karen was a geek. So, and if those, she actually listed a bunch of poems. If you look at the slides, the poems, most of them have links. And as well, I didn't link the news articles she uses, but this whole unit that she's talking about is laid out in a rough curriculum form. And I understand it has yet to be approved. Is that right, Karen? Are you lobbying to get it approved?
I'm still going forward. I'm still going forward with my curriculum.
Well, that was actually a question that I thought was great from one of our guests, Stephanie, who asks about basically how do we sneak it in when they want to stick to the classics? And I'm sort of like, are they looking at the news and the unrest that is happening? Do we not?
You know what? And I violated copyright stuff by photocopying like the Handmaid's Tale and stuff. But the other thing is that there are rules in districts that if you have no more than 10 students reading a certain book, they can read it. There are rules like that in districts, so you could almost have students all reading various books and having various discussions in the classroom. And that's one way, sort of like a literature circle type model, because my kids are constantly discussing anyway. So you could almost have, okay, these students are reading these 10 students are reading this book, kind of give them some options. And then a lot of students, they'll go out and buy the books. I don't ask them to do that, but they do that because they enjoy them, or they want to keep them, or they want to write in them, or, they speak to them. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get around it that we can talk about when something's not being recorded. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to get around, the whole approval process and stuff, because I know there are rules in districts that say, okay, you have to have fewer than so many copies in your classroom library, things like that. Also, if you give students choice, again, I'm not going to impede their choices. I'm not going to censor their choices. So I think there are ways around it, but it is an obstacle, but I think there are ways around it. So
there are ways around it. Yeah, I think, with the impending ethnic studies curriculum that's about to get passed, there's a lot of districts who are now locals, you all, as part of this work, are invited to lobby for your districts, your boards, to support ethnic studies. So there's sanctioned people at the CDE at Sacramento who are saying these conversations are much needed. It is part of our sanctioned curriculum to talk about these things, that the way you look affects the way you move through the world, and there's conflicts around it that we can solve. So I think you know, I mean, I think even CTA resources, you know, you might want to ask for some of the resolution language if that's the avenue you want to go. The other avenue is just to do it as a read aloud. So we're all probably going to be on blended learning, which means, you know what? They could click or they could not click. So it could be an optional read aloud and you're not forcing anything on anybody, but that's going to be the most engaging part of your day, I guarantee. So I don't know if Vanessa or Francisco or Erica, do you want to weigh in on, have you had pushback or comments from administration or colleagues about it?
So for me, we have separate standards or mindsets from ASCA, from the American School Counselors Association. So one of the main ones is providing multicultural competency to the students, speaking about race and things like that. So we have that. The one time that I did have, it was a principal, and she made a comment like, "Oh, why are you talking?" And I don't even remember what the book was about, but she mentioned, "Why was I talking about something like that too?" I think it was third graders. It was too much for them. And I said, "Well, why don't you come in and sit in the next time I do a lesson with third graders, and you can see that it's not too deep for them. It's good for them to talk about these things." And then I showed them the mindsets, and I said, "Look, this is part of what I need to be teaching. And if you want to give me a book that you feel would provide that, then, you know," and then she never did. So, but, you know, sometimes teachers, I can see when they're sitting there, they kind of look at me like, "Oh, why are we talking about this?" But once they see the way their students react and the conversations that come from it, I feel like teachers then start feeling a little bit like, "Oh, wait, I can talk about that. It's not gonna, you know, ruin my kids' lives or anything." And then sometimes I've had teachers come and say, "Hey, what other book can I piggyback on what you spoke about?" And so it's great. It's like I said, I have that opportunity to be the one that comes in and does something and then leaves, and then teachers can really piggyback on it.
I wanted to add to what Erica said because, I mean, when we think about social emotional learning and teaching the whole child, right, we have to be willing to be our whole selves, and all of us leave the classroom. We leave the classroom. We're there for 7.5 hours, and then we leave the classroom. We have lives outside of the classroom, and the kids have lives outside of the classroom. I don't think in any way, shape, or form, like Angela said, it could be a read aloud, that if you truly believe that what you're doing in the classroom is going to address something your students are struggling with outside of the classroom, that any administrator could, in good faith, tell you not to do it. Because we're really in the business of saving lives. And one of the most pressing, like, critical calls we have right now is to dispel all these narratives, because racial narratives are killing people. Like, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered because of a racial narrative, point blank. You know, and I think what we need to start talking about, even with our other teachers and administrative staffs, is that racism is no longer like KKK hoods and burning crosses, right? Like, racism now is so implicit, like we almost like miss it sometimes if we're not looking for it, or we don't know fully what it is, how it's operating in the capacity of 2020. Right now, we have to start being very unapologetic about the fact that we need to talk about our mindsets. We need to talk about students' mindsets. We need to talk about mindsets of the people that we're going to come across in the grocery store or at Disneyland or at Great America, or there's, you know, at the grocery store, right? Or on a jog. So really, I think that what I tell other teachers as well, when they're like, "Oh my God, what you do is so cool, but I'm afraid," right? And I get that. It's okay. Start where you feel safe. So again, like we talked about, we're going to talk about Ghost Boys. I know we're going to get there because I have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. But with blended too, I feel like it's really safe. It's very educational. It touches on family structures too, right? Kids who come from divorced families, broken families. There's so much healing that can happen through these books as well. And I think that if you believe in that first and you can convey that, I think people will just leave you alone. Like, that's just the experience I've had, is that when you're really passionate and you really believe in something, it's hard to tell somebody not to do it when you have so many reasons and benefits for doing it.
Well, and I think that Erica, you have to believe in it and make it work for you. You have to be comfortable with your approach. I think that's one key part. So if it's just having the book, having it on, I mean, I invite everyone to do an inventory of their bookshelves and really think, I mean, think about your own protagonist when you were growing up, you know, who was your hero? Did your hero look like you? And do your kids' heroes look like them? So having them exist in your classroom when there's not other stories is a huge, huge first step. But I think, you know, Erica also said when that other teacher saw the work, so the work can be academic too. I mean, these are not just read alouds where we just indoctrinate kids. There is vocabulary, there are Kahoots, there are study guides. So, you know, most of the books that we have come with author-driven discussion questions. And, you know, they can vary into the academic, but what we're really looking forward is voice, which is a standard, and writing, which is a standard, application of those two, which is a level 4 of those standards, right? So all of these things can be very academic, and you don't necessarily have to go into the deep, dark discussions. You know, I'm going to throw a strategy, and then I'm actually going to open it up, and I'm going to start with you, Francisco, because I know we've taught strategy. We both teach circuit, so we could geek out all day long if you want to talk like teaching, like actually like the lessons we do. But it's the strategies that we use in the classroom that are universal. You know, you don't have to use these books. I'm getting a lot of questions about like, what about this grade? What about that grade? So hopefully the approach that you take can go for any kind of any entry point. You know, I already explained this. The little kids are really more about self-identity and how you react. Middle kids can really handle conflict because they're little drama queens. And then upper grades, you're really looking at the comparative piece to what's happening now or other pieces, because they can get a little more complicated. But within that, things like quote brackets. So this is something that I've adapted for this. It's particularly powerful, but it's just a teaching strategy that I use with any book. But it's you challenge the kids to you want them to summarize. And you know, kids don't summarize. They just tell you the whole damn story all over again. So they have to summarize by picking a quote. So they're not creating it's like it's encapsulated in this quote. You can do another version of this that's hashtag. So you can hashtag a paragraph because close reading, or you can hashtag the chapter. And then smart kids realize that chapter titles can serve as hashtags and they're kind of the same thing. So then we have a whole text feature discussion. So you can get really geeky about these, and that kind of those techniques can be used with any book. But with these books, they tend to lend themselves just naturally to richer discussions. So prepare for your kids to be very engaged. So with that, I'm going to ask, you know, I'll start with Francisco and then open it up. We've got time check. We've got about 6 more minutes. Some strategies that you're going to use with these books so that people can be like, I could do that tomorrow. So mine is hashtag. They do is a bracket. So they fight each other and they get to vote. Like, Team A's hashtag and then Team B's hashtag, which one encapsulates the chapter best? And then they have to defend it, which is an academic discussion. So what's your strategy that you use with any of the books that you want to highlight?
So one thing that I just wanted to share and touch back on your last question, I think it's really important to find a co-conspirator and collaborate. Use the standards, because then after that, admin is not going to come after you. And one of the things that I found that's really useful as well is that the content and the level of engagement that our students produce and engage with when they're engaging in these in this literature is really telling by everything that they're able to produce. I really want a grade level partner, because halfway during my first year of teaching, I was teaching straight out from the anthology. And ever since, after I collaborated with her, I haven't done that ever since. And so one of the ways that I use the circuit and some of the books that I use in the classroom is just connecting contemporary life, right? So how would Francisco's life be different if he didn't get deported and DACA was around in those times? How do we connect that to contemporary issues of child labor and migrant child labor? There's over hundreds of thousands of US citizens who are picking our crops daily. That is not a new story. And so how do we make this content real for our students and really understand that, you know, racial narratives And racism is embedded within the fabric and ethos of the United States. And we need to just start with that. Once we understand that and understand that this is just a continuation, and as Vanessa said, all of the ways in which racism is perpetuated in subtle and covert ways is just another way that we could really understand that racism has not existed. We just have to find different ways in which it's manifesting itself and challenge and disrupt that.
Who's tagging in on this one? What do you do with your books?
Me, because
Disrupt those narratives.
we just haven't we haven't touched on Ghost Boys, so I'm just gonna segue this in and tell people to join our Google Classroom too for more ready-made lessons and things like that around Ghost Boys. So Ghost Boys is pretty much a fictional story of the murder of Tamir Rice, right? If you look up Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy playing with a fake gun outside, right? And it's so loaded. But what I found was amazing to do with this book, and again in 5th grade, was fishbowls around different chapters. And it was just so easy for my kids to do it without me setting any like, you know, obviously the guidelines for a fishbowl, but things like detailed in what happened between the Jerome and the cops, right? How many times he was shot. It's really scary to start to talk about, but what's cool about these books, and if you do these things with fishbowl onto each other, is that they drive the conversation. So one of, you know, kids are familiar with shooting guns with their families out out on the plains and whatever. And one kid, he shot 6 times in the back. Like, you don't shoot somebody that many times unless you're hunting. Whoa. Like, we're talking next level here, where we're trying to get, you know, adults in this country to understand that, like, these things aren't okay. We're no longer shooting to disable. It is shooting to kill. And these are ideas about the world that the students are creating on their own based on information presented. So and then the relationship between Jerome and the cop's daughter. She's a young white girl. How that relationship builds and how she begins her journey of becoming an anti-racist, right? So all of these things through Fishbowl allow kids to mess with each other and almost create ways of like next steps for themselves, because that's also, I think, of course, addressing the standards, but being able to give your kids, again, tools and that for producing humans that are going to go out in the world and hopefully human correctly, allowing them that space to create those ideas and brainstorm and next steps and PSA type things, right? Like, how could we solve this problem? How can we educate others? How can we be anti-racist? This is the perfect time for it because that word is so popular this year, right? So hopefully we can touch more on that in Google Classroom.
Okay, good, perfect segue, because we have like 2 minutes left and we need to come to a closing. So I just wanted to invite people. So Vanessa mentioned a Google Classroom. So someone is going to post it in the code. If not, it is in the links. It's linked in the slides that you all received because you're here. So along with your email, all the slides and all the resources, our contact information. So this workshop lives in various iterations in various formats. This was sort of a teaser. So I invite you to continue, and we are all available to continue this conversation in whatever formal ways, whether it's your local or you want to do it for your service center. Those are all appropriate places, so our contacts are in there. The Google Classroom is a place where you will be able to we're going to launch with Ghost Boys because that's like literally what I'm planning to launch with. So in real time, it's like an inquiry group, like our Plan Learning Network. And you know, issues, you can dive deep, you can get we'll post in real time what we're doing there, and hopefully offer support and some camaraderie as we move along this journey together. I'd like to thank our panelists. You are amazing, and I learn every time I am with you. And I'd like to thank our guests for being here and invite you to continue. This is just the beginning. This is just part of the journey. Get a book, read the book, do something with the book. And then next 28th will be the next Takeover Tuesday, and the topic will be being an anti-racist in a conservative area. Thank you to the back end people. Does anyone have any last minutes? things before we sign off because it is 5 o'clock. So thank you to our back end. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being there. And thank you for showing up for the work. I'm going to expect a 10-page book report from all of you in 2 days. Okay? All right. We're signing off and go forth and do the work. Bye.